Shabbat Shalom. By a show of hands, how many of you here are siblings? Have a brother or a sister? All right, almost everybody. Almost everybody. Now, I won't ask this question, how many of you competed with your brother or your sister growing up? All right, so you'll answer the question anyway. This side especially. Now being by the way, I'm a big brother. I have a younger brother, David, 5 years younger than me. And now being a parent myself of two boys, as the Roses know well, and as the Millers know well, you start to see a little bit of competition from the earliest of ages. Children, and especially siblings, compete with each other. That's what they do. From the youngest of ages, they compete for parents' love and affection. They compete for natural resources. They compete for food. I know, Rebecca served steak last night at the dinner table. You should have seen my two boys going after it. We compete from the youngest of ages for everything. It's part of what it means to be a kid. It's especially part of what it means to be a sibling, is to compete. Now, of course, as we get older, we learn to compete in different ways. We compete for wealth. We compete for love. But when it comes to our siblings, by and large, the competition reduces and we learn to partner together. And in fact, one of the signs of adulthood is that you learn and understand that you get more by partnering with others. Right? It's part of the prisoner's dilemma model, if you've ever studied that we start to learn that the more we work together with others, sure, we may not get everything, but we gain a lot more when we work together with others. Of course, there's a name for people who grow up and never really relinquish that need to compete for power or for glory. That need to see everything as a zero-sum game of winning and losing. Do you know what the name that we call somebody who is constantly competing with others for power, for glory, even well into their adulthood? We call them a U.S. Senator. There are a lot of people at prayer and paying attention today, and it's probably not just the Michigan game that they're focusing on. We think a lot these days and these weeks about power and about competing for power, about competition, about winning and losing in zero-sum games. And so it is that we turn to our Torah portion this week, Parashat Bereshit. And as I mentioned earlier, we've started the Torah all over again, and here we are in the very beginning. And we see hints within Bereshit of God sending us very clear messages about human nature and about what we must do to overcome that human nature. I'd like to invite you to turn with me in your Eitz Chaim Chumashim to page 24. On page 24 in the Chumash we are on, we're in the midst of Genesis now at the very beginning, chapter 4. We've already read about creation. We've already read about Adam and Eve. We've already read about the serpent and Adam and Eve eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We read about God kicking man and woman out of the Garden of Eden. God is sad about doing that. God is sad about taking away their immortality. And perhaps as a result of God's sadness at what had transpired, God decides to give Adam and Eve a gift to help overcome their newfound mortality. God gives Adam and Eve children. And it says here, V'adam yada et Chava ishto. Now the man, that is Adam, knew his wife Chava, his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore a son Cain, saying, I have gained a male child with the help of the Lord. Eve then bore Cain's brother, Abel. And because of the language of the text, our rabbis actually read that Cain and Abel were twin brothers. Imagine that. Abel became a keeper of sheep, and Cain became a tiller of the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the soil. Now we would think that that's a good thing, right? Cain brought an offering of the Lord from the fruit of the soil. Cain was trying to please God. Cain was seemingly trying to say thank you to God for all that he was able to reap from the harvest. And Abel, for his part, brought the choicest of the firstlings of his flock. The Lord paid heed to Abel and his offering, but to Cain and his offering he paid no heed. Now the Torah doesn't tell us why God favored Abel's offering over Cain's. The Torah doesn't tell us what exactly it was that Abel brought that God so much preferred to whatever Cain brought. Perhaps there are hints of it in the text when it says that Abel brought the firstlings of his flock. Abel brought his very best. And perhaps not only that, but in the Hebrew, it says in verse 4, Behevel hevi gam hu mibicharot sono. Perhaps Abel not only brought the firstlings of his flock, but Abel brought all of himself to this offering. Whatever the reason, and it's not clear, we know that God preferred Abel's offering to Cain's. Now here we are in the middle of verse 5. Cain was much distressed, and his face fell. And the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you distressed, and why is your face fallen? Surely if you do right, there is uplift. But if you do not do right, sin couches at the door. Its urge is toward you, yet you can be its master. You can be sin's master." Cain said to his brother Abel. We don't know what Cain said to his brother Abel. The ellipse is trying to symbolize what the Hebrew of the original text comes to omit. We don't know what one brother said to the other brother. But we learn what happens next. And when they were in the field, Cain set upon his brother, Abel, and he killed him. The Lord said to Cain in somewhat of a rhetorical question, "Where is your brother Abel?" And he said, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" The question remains unanswered here in the text. God goes on to continue to engage Cain in conversation. Ultimately, God punishes Cain for this first act of homicide, which comes in the form of fratricide. God punishes Cain by kicking him out of the land, by punishing him eternally to wander, though God puts a mark on Cain that no one should come to hurt him. The question floats out there, am I my brother's keeper? The question remains for us to answer to this day. Now, I happen to have just finished a wonderful book. I'll say it's new. It was new to me. It's published in 2015 by Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. I don't think, by the way, you can find a better title for a rabbi than Lord. But in Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, author of some 30-plus books, he said that in this book, Not in God's Name, that he wrote about religious war and about killing in God's name. The name of the book is Not in God's Name. It's one of the finest books I've read in quite some time. I recommend it to everybody. And Rabbi Sacks seems to suggest that the entire book of Genesis is about answering the question, am I my brother's keeper? The entire book of Genesis comes to teach us that while it may be within humankind's nature to compete with each other, what it means to grow up as a person, as a family, as a people, is about learning to partner with those we love. It's about learning to partner with each other, because we get so much more done in partnership than in trying to win a zero-sum game. Rabbi Sacks goes on to point out other sibling relationships in Genesis. It starts with Cain and Abel, where it seems as if God favors one over another, though the text really comes to teach us that God just favored a sacrifice over another sacrifice, not a child over another child. Who are the next real brothers that we come to learn about in the Torah? Isaac and Ishmael. And we learn about Sarah and Hagar, their mothers, and how Sarah and Hagar competed for Abraham's love. And we learn then about Isaac and Ishmael and how the mothers fought over these children, and ultimately Isaac wins. And the Torah tells us that something happened between Isaac and Ishmael. It's not clear. Ishmael is banished from the tent. Isaac and Ishmael never reconnect until they come together to bury their father Abraham, though the Torah doesn't tell us whether they had much of a relationship thereafter. Then we go on and we come to read about Jacob and Esau. And we know that they were twins as well in the competition that they held for the birthright and for inheritance of the covenant. We learn about their fight and of how Jacob has to flee in order to save his own life from his brother Esau. And we learn about how ultimately they do come to reconcile after Jacob wrestles with the angel and becomes Israel. About how they reconcile but ultimately still go their separate ways. And then Genesis wraps up with yet one more story of sibling rivalry and contention. The story of Joseph and his brothers. And how does that story ultimately end? We know how it begins. There's a wonderful musical about it if you haven't seen it. We know how the story ends, though, too. Judah, being in the same opportunity to abandon a brother, doesn't. He protects his younger brother Benjamin. And seeing that, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. He says, I'm your brother Joseph. Don't worry about all that you've done wrong to me up until this point. Clearly it was part of God's plan. I forgive you. And in that moment of forgiveness, all of the brothers, the children of Jacob, reunite. And there, because of their newfound partnership and working together, because they put their sibling rivalry in check, the Israelites were able to survive a famine and ultimately make their way down into Egypt, where they became so much more than just a family. They became a people and a nation. It seems that entire book of Genesis, which we begin now, is about the obligation for men and women, for brothers and sisters, husbands and wives, communities. The entire book of Genesis is about learning to work together, to share in mutual responsibility and thus share in mutual success. The entire book of Genesis is about learning that we get so much more out of life when we learn to partner with each other. Now, I'll tell you, over the course of the summer, I was visiting at someone's house and they had a Moment magazine sitting on their coffee table. And we know Moment magazine, it's a Jewish magazine. And the huge headline at the top of Moment magazine, it said, "The Year of the Woman." Now I looked at that and said, wait a second. The Year of the Woman? Why are they leaving me out? Why are they leaving me out? I'm a man. Why are they leaving me out? And then, of course, it occurred to me that as a man, I've had 5,777 years. I can give the women this one. It's all about competing for power. We know that from the youngest of ages, that is what we do. We compete for power. We compete for glory. And friends, what we've been watching over the last week is about a competition for power. It's about a competition for glory. It's about winning and losing. And it's not about what's best for this country or the world. Perhaps this week, as we read Parashat and remember Cain and Abel, we can come to realize that while there are sometimes winners and losers, at the end of the day, our families, our nation, our people, and our world are better and are stronger when we learn to work together instead of against each other. This Shabbat of Parashat Bereshit, may we learn well the lessons of the book of Genesis and Parashat Bereshit, that we can become like Adam and Eve and like the children of Jacob, adults who learn to work together. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will, and let us say together.